Do we want to hear from LAO? If members would not mind, maybe we could hear from LAO and then have our questions to both. Mac.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members. On Monday, my office put out our overview of the governor's budget. A little, not quite as long as the governor's document, maybe a little easier for you to get through. It provides a description of the major proposals in the budget and our initial comments. And I'm really just going to make a few of those verbally. I'm not going to even refer to the report, but I hope that you and your staffs find that document helpful. Let me start with sort of big picture. I think we would agree with Ms. Bosler that I think the governor's budget is a very prudent plan. It's a good framework, a good starting point. In November, when we put out our November fiscal outlook, we noted these operating surpluses that we were forecasting and suggested that you give very high priority to paying off debts and building up your reserves. And if you look at not only this budget, but what the governor has planned for the next few years, he does just that. He would build up a reserve of roughly $8 billion, pay off all of the existing wall of debt within a 3 or 4 year period. You can disagree with the particulars, but having that sort of rough framework and those goals we think is very valuable. So generally, we're very positive about the governor's approach. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that you don't have room to maneuver within that. You can change the nature of the augmentations that he has proposed. You can change debt repayments. You can make additional commitments. So clearly, you'll have to put your mark on the budget, but we think it's a very good, solid starting point. Let me just identify a couple of other what we think are positives. The Proposition 98 is kind of like a budget within the budget. You have to know what is committed under the formulas before you can sort of do your whole budget. And in this case, Prop 98 is getting a lot of extra money. It's got about $7.6 billion increase over the current year, as Ms. Bosler mentioned, about $11 billion over all prior years. So they're the big winner right now. And the governor proposes that basically two things. In fact, it's probably the simplest Prop 98 budget I've seen in a very long time. He proposes to pay off all the school deferrals with the one-time monies and a piece of the 14-15 monies, and then spend $4.5 billion roughly to augment your local control funding formula that you just passed. We think, again, that's very wise in the sense that it gets these deferrals off the table. It gives them schools a lot of money to build on the local control funding formula. It's a nice mix of one-time versus ongoing expenditures of Prop 98, such that if our capital gains revenue or other revenues turns out not to be as high as we suggest, you have a mechanism to where schools won't be in the position where their ongoing funding will be reduced on a year-to-year basis. So again, we think it's a very good starting point, not that you don't have decisions that you can make within that Proposition 98 budget. We're also very positive about the administration's emphasis on infrastructure. As was noted, this is the first plan that you've received since 2008. And I would suggest to you that currently the legislature is really not, from an institutional perspective, very capable of dealing with infrastructure issues. In prior years, you have had actually subcommittees on capital outlay. And that didn't work out very well because it separated out program and capital decisions. But I would really strongly encourage the legislature to think about institutionally, how do you deal with this infrastructure report that the administration has given you? How do you make those higher level decisions about what level of bonding do you want each year? How do you think about alternative sources other than the general fund? What is a state responsibility? What is a local responsibility? For example, the administration raises very important issues about, well, who should be providing school building facilities? And I think that's worth deciding, because right now schools have no certainty about when they're going to get monies. It all depends on when a bond is issued. And then even if the bond is approved, you have to get in line, and you're not guaranteed when you're going to get money from the state to match your local revenues. It's not the best system. So I think putting that on the table for your discussion is a very important point. Anyway, we're very positive about the administration. For example, the deferred maintenance proposal. It's a down payment towards trying to eliminate some of our built up in deferred maintenance. But again, the goal should be you should not have deferred maintenance. You have a problem if you have deferred maintenance, because you should never have gotten to that point if you invest and maintain your assets as you should. So again, I think these kind of issues, I'm really glad to see more visibility, and I think it's a plus in the governor's proposal. Just a few concerns. I think the higher ed proposal is very similar to last year in that the governor's raised some very good issues about how we provide our higher ed services. We have high-cost programs. We don't focus on performance. We have problems with getting good performance out of our systems, so I think the governor deserves credit for raising those issues again. We have similar problems that we had with the proposal last year, in that the governor gives money to the systems, even though he says he has serious concerns with them, and yet there is nothing that ties that funding with your priorities. Whether it's enrollment, there are no enrollment targets, whether it's achieving certain things that you want the segments to do in terms of performance or other things. So I think you really should spend a lot of time, and if you're going to give the segments that amount of money, what are you getting in return? You also need to think about your tuition policy again. Everyone loves to be able to say we're going to keep tuition flat. But I tell you, it's a recipe for disaster. It's going to guarantee when our next downturn is, you're going to have the same sort of roller coaster that we talk about on capital gains with tuition if you leave it flat for a long time. So I really encourage you to think about a longer-term tuition fee policy. We don't have one now. On cap and trade, the administration is proposing $250 million for high-speed rail. In the past, we have raised issues in our discussions with Legislative Council of whether there are legal concerns with doing so, of spending these mitigation fees. Is it closely enough tied to be able to spend on high-speed rail? We'll leave that to Council in your discussion. I think there is some legal risk still there. We do raise a separate policy issue, and it's related to what the Chair was raising and talking about relative rates of returns of program. The high-speed rail is a net emitter through 2020 when you're supposed to be reaching your AB 32 goals. So to use it for mitigation is just programmatically maybe is clearly not the best return. There may be a lot of other expenditures you make that could give you far more emissions for every dollar spent. So I think you have both legal issues with it, but also you have policy issues. And I think you need to put that in light of what I assume the administration is suggesting, and that is, since we don't have an alternative funding source for high-speed rail, it seems to me they're suggesting we may have to use these funds, these cap-and-trade auction revenues, not just for 14-15, but for many years. And again, that may be okay. That may be what you decide to do if you're legally able to do it. But it means there's not going to be a lot of money for other things because you're going to need a lot more funds to finish off even the initial operating segment. Let me turn briefly to the economy and revenues. We don't have many differences with the administration on our basic economic forecast. On revenues, many of you will remember when we were here in May, the administration's revenue forecast was considerably below ours. In November, we increased our revenue estimates even from where we were at the time of the budget considerably because of improvements in the financial markets. So that in November, if you looked at for 14-15 and all prior years, we were about $9.5 billion above the administration's forecast from May, from June when we passed the budget. Now, the administration has come up significantly since then, and the differences between our offices are not considerable given the sort of uncertainty surrounding revenue estimates. They still are below us by $2 or $3 billion over the whole period, but we're much closer together. I would say that in December, which is a key month for estimated payments, the state did especially well. Cash flows were far above what either of us had estimated. We're still waiting for estimated payments for the January 15th. Yesterday was the deadline. We'll know a lot more next week. But we've advised you that you should plan on the possibility that you could have even more money than what's in the governor's budget when you get to the May revision. Now, I offer that is just because this is your starting point, and as you plan throughout the spring, I think that's important. And let me give a plug for two things that I think you need to consider. One is just building up further reserves. If, in fact, you have more money in May than what we're forecasting or what the administration is forecasting now, it will probably be due in large part to capital gains, which suggests you need to be even more careful in setting aside bigger reserves than you have now. A lot of that money will have to go to schools, and what's left over, we suggest you give very high priority to increasing the level of reserves. And secondly, I would urge you to think about your retirement obligations. The administration says we want to engage, say, for example, with CalSTRS and how we can address our liabilities, our huge liabilities for that system. We would suggest that you actually set aside some monies for it. It doesn't mean you have to have your plan in place. These are costs you've already incurred. They're costs that you need to set aside and pay. The sooner that you do it, the easier it will be on you. So those would be two very high priorities I would suggest to you when you get to May, especially if you have additional resources. If I could close, Madam Chair, with just some comments about the rainy day reserve, because I think it's one of the most important issues you have in front of you. You know, I get asked a lot, well, what could the state do to improve our fiscal situation? And I always answer, the number one thing that you should do is improve your reserve practices, your rainy day reserve practices. And I've been very happy that we've had a lot better discussion about the problems of revolving around reserves in recent years. ACA 4, I think, advanced that debate a lot. The Speaker put out a proposal, his own, that was oriented towards capital gains, which the administration, I think, has kind of used. Both proposals, in my view, are spot on what they're trying to achieve. One, they're trying to take money off the table in good years, above average years. And that has two benefits. One, it prevents you from making ongoing commitments that you can't sustain when the economy turns south. And two, you also take the money off the table, and if you put it in a reserve, you have that pot of money that can cushion the downturn and the effects of it, and it helps you smooth out your budgetary decisions. So to me, those are the things that you should be doing, and both ACA 4 and the governor's proposal, the Speaker's proposals, attempting to do the same things. Now, they're very different mechanisms, but their goals, it seems to me, are exactly the same, and I think they're exactly the right goals. Now, in our report, we did issue some initial comments about some concerns that we have with both proposals, and I think they really all relate to the issue of, can you constitutionalize good budgeting behavior? And members, when I first came to the office, seemingly eons ago, I worked on the GAN appropriations limit. And this was another effort which was taken to try to, in effect, put in the Constitution good budgeting practices. And while it did work, or it constrained spending for a short period of time, for the last 15 years or so, we've been far under the GAN. It hasn't really been a factor. The GAN limits also had the process of reimbursing local governments for mandates. It was one provision of the GAN limits. Again, it was trying to constitutionalize good budgeting practices by forcing the state to pay for things that it imposed on local governments. I don't think anyone could take exception to the goal of it, but I don't think anyone from local governments to the state has been happy with the processes we've had. It's been messy, it's been inefficient, we don't pay locals on time, we're upset when the Commission on State Mandates requires us to do things, the courts require us to do things that we don't think we should have to pay. It's not a good process. Proposition 98 is another example of trying to constitutionalize certain budgeting practices. And it was a relatively simple measure when it started off. It's a couple of pages in the Constitution. We amended it in Prop 111, we've had statutory requirements, we've done rebenchings, we've done deferrals, we've done all sorts of things. And from a budgeting perspective, 98 is sort of this incomprehensible mess that we have now. So without speaking to people's good intentions, because I think, again, both measures are right on, the question is, can you put this in the Constitution? And in our document, we raised just a couple of examples on both ACA 4 and on the governor's proposal. ACA 4 is a very complex measure. I would challenge you to read through it and see if you can just follow how the mechanics of it work. It also has a 20-year revenue regression that we are not sure is really completely workable. And it's a key measure of trying to take the money off in the good years. It's a mechanism that's trying to be used to achieve this really good goal. With regards to the governor's proposal, you should be thinking about your capital gains revenue. It is a key source of volatility. It's not the only source. Our corporate tax is very volatile. Other sources of business income are volatile. But it is a key indicator of our volatility. But it's somewhat ironic that the administration would say that this measure of volatility that we can't estimate, that we don't have good data on for 2 years until after the fact, is what we're going to use to put in the Constitution to bind your hands and determine what is going to go into the reserve. Even if 6.5% of capital gains is the right number now, is it going to be the right number 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What if the state changes its revenue structure? What if you do a different realignment that changes the percentage of general fund revenues? What if the federal government changes its treatment of capital gains that affects how often California taxpayers take it? I'm just not sure practically how you make this work on either measure. I appreciate the fact that we haven't done a good job at our budgeting in the past of why you might want to put something in the Constitution. Do remember, you have Proposition 58. And in some ways, we haven't really given 58 a chance to work. The governor is allowing 58 to work in 1450. He's saying we're going to have the reserve set aside of the 3%. It would only take another 2 or 3 years before you were up to your reserve maximum. So you also have the alternative, if you do want to think about constitutional alternatives, you can think about perhaps tightening up Proposition 58, which I think is, it doesn't have strong teeth to get to you exactly where you want, but to me it's a very good framework in that it sets out your goals of a reserve level, and it sets out a mechanism of saying you need to take off the top every year revenues until your reserve is at a level that you think it should be at. So you do have other alternatives in addition to ACA 4 and the governor's proposal. But let me finish with, regardless of what happens, you may put a measure on the ballot and the voters turn it down. Does that mean we can't do anything to address our problems? Well, of course not. I think it's actually as important, perhaps more important, that you establish through your own practices as an institution that you value a high reserve, that when you budget you take into account things like capital gains, like the Speaker has put on the table, and other sources of volatility, and that you recognize during good years you cannot spend and commit all that money. And through practices and traditions and changing the culture, you may do more than what a constitutional measure can do, that through intentionally or unintentionally it's too easy to sort of work around it. So I would just close with saying that things are a lot different now than they were 10 or 15 years ago. People understand our volatile revenue structure much better than they did 10 or 15 years ago. People understand why you have to have a reserve. So I would say the environment's changed. That doesn't really guarantee that we will establish those good traditions, but I think there is a much greater chance now than there was a decade ago for you as an institution to do that. Madam Chair, obviously my staff, my colleagues are here to serve you throughout the whole budget process in whatever way we can. We'll be coming out with more detailed analyses of the various proposals in the coming weeks, and we're here to assist you in whatever way we can.
Thank you so much, and we obviously will look forward to and know that we'll hear at each one of our hearings from both you and your staff, LAO staff, and the Department of Finance, and of course all of us on the committee, and actually all members have the right and ability to go to you and the Department of Finance directly if they do have questions about either what's proposed or how as we go forward. And I won't really ask you to opine on this, but I would only, because you in a way did, but I would only raise once again that when people like myself just experienced where we cut, meaning, my votes cut over $40 billion in general fund expenditures in the time I've been in office. And even with the most ambitious rainy day fund type of proposals, it's hard to imagine getting to a $40 billion in in a foreseeable future. And while I hope we never have such a downturn, I do know we will have downturns. It's that kind of, it's like, yes, we need a rainy day fund. Yes, we need to be prudent. But how much of our, if we look at, is our education spending, which we now hear from the business community, where we seem to have a less prepared workforce. That's critical to our, or definitely negatively impacting potentially our economy if we're not if we are not properly preparing our workforce. Or if we look at the deferred maintenance or the transportation infrastructure needs or water infrastructure needs, are we, again, is it, they only grow in cost if we wait. So I think these are many of the things that we are going to have to weigh in this process. So I said it before, I'll leave it, but I am starting to take a list, and I have so far on the list Mr. Dickinson, Mr. Murasucci, Mr. Chesbro, okay, Mr. Reggie Jones, Mr. Tang. Let's start with Dickinson, and I'll continue this list.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentations this morning. I would just perhaps say in slightly different terms what the chair has said, which is I suspect there's broad concurrence on the three prongs that have been identified as the underpinnings of the budget: saving for a rainy day, strategic investments, and paying down debt directionally. The debate will be over how far in each direction we go, and that's going to be a lively and very interesting debate over the next several years. But I hope none of us will forget that during the course of the recession and the cuts that have been made in state expenditures, it is those who are the least able to afford those cuts, the most vulnerable, the middle class, those who need an education, who have suffered the greatest harm in the past several years. And every piece of economic news that we get tells us that those who have been better off, who were better off going in to the recession, came out much better off, while those who were not in nearly as good shape going in came out worse. So I hope that that will be something that we all bear in mind during the course of the next several months as we go through this process. I'm sure my colleagues will ask about some of the largest picture items. I wanted to focus on two things, if I may, that are a little bit more discrete. The first has to do with the administration's court funding proposal. And while I think the additional $100 million for court operations is certainly welcome, I would be interested to know why the administration thinks that's sufficient in light of what the LAO points out, which is a $200 million loss of one-time money that's been used to keep court operations going at the level that they are, which has included significant and serious reductions in access to justice, and $65 million in additional obligations related to retirement and other purposes. So that, in a sense, the net loss to the courts is $265 million, while the administration is proposing $100 million in additional funds. And so my first question is, why does the administration think that $100 million is sufficient to maintain even the minimal level of access to justice that we have without incurring further loss of access to justice? My second question has to do with the infrastructure plan and the proposal of the administration. And I applaud the fact that we have an infrastructure plan presented, but I want to focus particularly on that which relates to the Department of General Services and the state infrastructure. We have in certain places in this town, if not elsewhere around the state, and I'm sure we do, circumstances where state employees are going to work in unsafe conditions, in conditions that in some instances literally make them sick. And we are incurring both the detriment to their health as well as costs on an ongoing basis as a result of that. And a classic example is the Board of Equalization building just a few blocks from here. And let me use that as an example because the Department of General Services put out a request for information just a couple months ago, asking for those who might be interested in proposing solutions that would help the state get out of the Board of Equalization building in its current condition, replacing that, providing new facilities for the Board of Equalization, and constructively and effectively reusing the Board of Equalization building. Why would we wait 5 years to study these circumstances when we know exactly what the conditions are? We know there are people in the private sector interested in assisting the state in solving the issues that have arisen, and we know that it's not going to get cheaper, it's going to get more expensive. So those are my two questions related to the courts and to infrastructure, specifically state buildings.
Yes, and I'll answer your court question first. We have provided $105 million for the judicial branch in this budget, and while more is always seems to be better, we do recognize that there are growing costs in the judiciary in the entire judicial branch, and that's in that recognition is why we provided the $100 million. As we discussed in our budget summary document, there has been considerable, the court system, since we moved to consolidate funding and consolidate the court system, state funding at the state level, it's been an evolution, and not all courts are created equal. Some have been able to weather the downturn in the economy and the reduced funding well. Others have really struggled because they probably were underfunded to start with. And so that's an issue that I think the judicial branch as a whole is really grappling with, about how to better manage their resources as a system and not look at themselves as 58 different courts. And that's what underpins many of the policy decisions that have been made over the last couple of years regarding the trial court reserves. The trial courts do have reserves, but they will be held at the state level judiciary instead of at the local trial court. And it's in an effort to try and really make sure that critical access issues of the entire system are really being addressed. Also, I think there's from where we sit, we see that there are some courts that haven't done enough to contain some of their costs as compared to the state. And so we discussed that in the budget document, that we would like to see the same sort of pension reform extended to the court employees across the state as well. These are not things that we control. These are things that are bargained locally at the trial court level, but because the state is footing the bill, I think it's important that we get that incentive structure correctly. Of course, we did just receive the Chief Justice's review, and we are thoroughly going through that right now. The budget's a living document. We understand that, so we are taking a greater look at some of the concerns that she has. Also, on the infrastructure plan, we do have I believe it's $2.5 million. One of my folks can help me out on that, for the Department of General Services to really do a master plan for the Sacramento area. The state does own a lot of buildings. There's also a lot of employees in lease space. There's a real need to update many of the key older buildings that we all see on our way to work here in the downtown area. And so the Department of General Services is actively going through the planning process to really do a master plan and address many of the deficiencies that exist. I understand your frustration about the Board of Equalization building. That's something that's been around for a while. I've also had many unsatisfying discussions about that topic. I don't have a specific answer for you right now about the private interests. I would have to get back to you on that. But I do think it's an issue that we are not ignoring, that we want to find a solution to.
I know there are others who want to ask. One brief follow-up comment. On the Board of Equalization, just as an example, we may spend over the next 5 years another $20 to $50 million trying to keep that building habitable, while we spend $2.5 million to study it for 5 years. That is coming back to investments and how you use your money would not seem to be an equation which makes much sense. Thanks.
We'll leave that as a comment, and we'll go to Mr. Murasucci.